In this video, I want to demonstrate how to map HL7 messages into the various UltraRAD products, whether it's an Ultra Gateway, UltraBROKER, Ultra Prefetch. All of our products use the same HL7 processing utilities. In this case, I'm going to show you how to map these messages into the UltraBROKER database, which is used by most of our products. So the first step is we want to take a look at these HL7 messages. In this example, I'm going to use HL7 orders. So I'm going to open up an HL7 order in Notepad++. So I have a directory full of some sample messages that I created. So if I look at one in my text editor, you can see here I have a couple different segments. One thing to note is the first three letters are always the segment identifier. So this message has an MSH, a PID, PV1, ORC, OBR, and ZZZ. The MSH through OBR are pretty typical for an ORM message, ORM. And I know this is an ORM because I can see it right here. It's an ORM 001. That's the message type that I'll be mapping. Some messages have different orders of segments, so it is important to note what order these segments are in, which segments are here. I also have a private segment in this message. I just wanted to show you that you could map the private segments if you like. It's not typical to see these private segments, and usually when you see them, they don't have information that you need anyway. But if you do have something in there that you want to map, it does happen. So I'll show you how to do that as well at the end. So now that I'm kind of getting familiar with what this message looks like so I can map it, and again, this is what it looks like as a text file, but if I use my utility, so in your UltraRAD products folder, so in my case it's under UltraBROKER, the bin directory, and inside there is the Ultra HL7 dictionary tool. The dictionary tool is the tool that allows you to set up a configuration file that's going to instruct the broker on how to process an HL7 message into our database. So there are two things that we have to know ahead of time before we do a dictionary mapping, before we create that dictionary file that's going to tell the system how to map into the database. First, we need to have a basic understanding of the database structure, the tables that we're going to be mapping the data into, which basically creates an order or a report record. And second, we have to understand the HL7 message that we're mapping and what data points are available for us to map into that database. So I'm going to show you how to figure out both of these prerequisites. First, let's take a look in the dictionary tool. So when you open the dictionary tool, it's going to ask you which configuration file you'd like to edit or work with. By default, in most of our products, you'll have a C dictionary file. That's the default dictionary file or configuration file. You can make a copy of it for whatever RIS or EMR or HIS system you're creating the mapping for. But either way, you can start with that dictionary file. So I'm going to open up my C dictionary file, and this one is a plain vanilla dictionary file. It has no settings in it yet. So the first step is I want to take a look at that message just to see what's in it. So if I click on Message Process, I can go and load that message. So here's message number 56. It's the same one that you see here in Notepad++. I'm going to open that message. On the left-hand side, it shows me all the segments and fields that are found in the message. For example, if I look in the patient identification segment, I can see that the patient ID is in field 2. I can see that the patient's name is in field 5, and it consists of various parts. So the given name, which is component 2, is Wayne. Component 1 contains the last name, in this case Martin, and so forth and so on. So you can go through and kind of figure out where all these different fields are. So in the visit, I can see that we have a location code embedded in the visit, which is helpful. That might be something worth mapping. I've got a referring doctor's name in here that I might be able to map. One of the things I'm looking for when I go through this is to make sure I understand where all of the identifiers are. For example, I know that there's a patient ID in the PID segment in field number 2. It could be in another field. In some systems, you'll get it in field 3 or field 4. And sometimes you get multiple patient IDs, and I'll show you how to map those as well towards the end of the video. But for now, let's keep it simple with a single patient ID. You can see here with the common order segment, I have both a I have a placer order number. Sometimes you'll find the identifier for the study to be in the place or the filler order number. You have to typically consult with the sender of the message to figure out which is the right field to map. And likewise, in the observation request, I also have a placer order number, which is the primary identifier for that instance of that study. There's also an identifier for the procedure, which we find in the Universal Service ID. So this particular study has an identifier of 56, which means it's a CT neck soft tissue, and the coding schema is URC. Typically, you'll see things like CPT4 or ICD coding and things like that. Whatever coding mechanism is used. In many cases, you'll see multiple versions. So you'll have codes for multiple codes for the same procedure. Maybe there'll be a CPT code, maybe there'll be an internal code, a billing code, other types of codes, and sometimes they'll list a bunch of them in there, and you'll see them all listed as repeats. There's only one repeat in this particular message, but if there are other ones, you would see additional repeats. All right, so those are all the basic fields. Down here in field 24, in this particular message, I mapped the modality code in field 24, which seems to be pretty typical. A lot of systems are using that field, but you may not have the modality code, and there are some ways to deal with that, which I'll talk about at the end. All right, so I've got a basic understanding of what the message looks like. My next step is let's make sure we understand the database structure. So in order to have a complete order, you have to have a patient record, a visit for that patient, a requested procedure, and that procedure needs to have a scheduled procedure step. Those are the 4 fields or 4 database tables that must be populated in order to have a complete order. There are other tables in our database that can be populated for an order, but these are the 4 at minimum that must be populated. You can't skip any of these tables. So for example, I can't have an order, I can't map something into the scheduled procedure step and assume I'll have an order. There must be a corresponding requested procedure, which references a visit, which references a patient. So when I map my fields into the database, you'll notice that in this diagram, there are little keys next to certain fields. The key that you see next to the NID, so usually there's an N something ID. The NID is an auto-generated identifier that we create in the database. The STR ID is the ID that you map. So taking a look at the N patient, or the patient table on the left-hand side, you'll notice at the top there's an N patient ID. That's created by us when we map something into the database. So that's automatically created by UltraRAD's products when we parse in an HL7 message. The STR patient ID is the one that you're mapping from the message. So you have to map some primary identifier for a patient into that STR patient ID field in the database. All of the other fields are optional. You must map a patient ID. You can see there's a second field, a second key in patient, which is the issuer of the patient ID. So every patient has an issuer. That issuer is usually automatically populated from the MSH segment. So in most messages, the MSH segment will tell you where that message came from, and that identifier as to where the message came from is what is the issuer of the patient ID. In that way, we can ensure that patients that are ordered from different systems can have overlapping patient IDs, but will not overlap those records on our side. So we can have different patients with the same ID coming from multiple different systems, and it won't break our database because of the issuer patient ID. You could map a value into the issuer patient ID, but the system will do it automatically for you if you fail to do that. Taking a look at the visit table, you must map the issuer, the admission ID. It's not typical to have an admission ID in the HL7 messages, so typically you'll end up just using the patient ID for that field. So it's not typical to have a visit admission ID, so usually we just use the patient ID for that. The N visit master ID, you can see there's a key on that field. That is a reference to the N patient ID from the patient field, so that is the foreign key to the patient table. And that's what the word master means. So when you see master, that means it's referencing the other table. It's a little bit confusing because of the way it's named as N visit. It's not actually a visit ID, it's actually the patient ID. So it's the N patient ID as a foreign key. The requested procedure is the same thing. So we have an STR requested procedure ID. You can see it right here with the key. So we have to map something in as the STR requested procedure ID, and it references to the visit. And then finally, the scheduled procedure must also have its own ID, which references back to the requested procedure. So that's basically how the structure of the database. And again, at minimum, we must have these tables populated. If you forget which fields must have a value, If you forget whether it's the STR admission ID or the NVisit ID or the issuer of admission ID, if you forget, you can always just go and look in the database and look at those keys in the database using Management Studio, which you see I have here. But at this point, we know what those fields are. And there's a whole bunch of other fields. So what I do when I look at this is I look at these other fields and I start to think about what other things that I can map from that message. So I can see patient name, patient's date of birth, the sex, and so forth and so on. So there are lots of data points that I can map into these messages. All right. So now that we know the database, let's go back to our dictionary tool and start mapping some fields. So I'm going to click on Dictionary, Customize. When I go into Dictionary Customize, the first step is I have to create the message type. So I have to add the message type as something that I'm going to map. So I go into the drop-down and I choose ORM because I know I'm creating an ORM message. So I want to be able to map an ORM message. The type of ORM I'm mapping is an O01. There are many different types of messages for certain message types, or many different events rather. For example, ADT has somewhere around 50 different event types. An ORM, on the other hand, only has one, the O01. There may be some, I think there's one other one, but it's not common. But O01 is typically what we're mapping. So I'm going to hit Create Basic Message. And you can see here, it created the basic message with only 2 segments. At a minimum, most ORM messages at a minimum have at least an MSH and an ORC segment. But we know that our message has additional segments that we want to map. So first, I'm going to add underneath MSH, I can see over here, so I'm leaving this up for reference, I have a PID, PV1, ORC, OBR, and ZZZ. So coming back over here, I'm going to make sure I make this look just like my message that I'm going to be mapping. So first, I'm going to add the PID segment. Then I'm going to add the PV1 segment. Then after ORC, I have an OBR segment. And those are all the message segments that I need to map. I do have a ZZZ segment at the end. I'm not going to map that right now. You don't have to add those segments if you don't need to map them. So the segments that you're not worried about mapping, you don't have to add to this list. But there are elements in all of these that I want to map, so I'm going to add those to my basic message. And then I'm going to save that. So at the bottom, I have to hit Save. Once you do that, you'll see it added to the drop-down. So now I have that message type in my drop-down list. So now I have a message type that I could use, the ORM message type. So I'm going to go over to Database Mapping, and I'm going to start mapping my ORM message type. So first, here's a list of the tables. At a minimum, I have to map into the patient table, visit, request a procedure, and schedule procedure step. The other tables you see here are optional, but I'll talk about some of the optional fields that we may want to populate later. But for right now, let's just do the bare minimum. So I know that I have to map a patient ID. So I'm going to go over here, and if you recall, we know that the patient ID was in field number 2. So I'm going to select those fields and hit Add. I'm also going to add the patient's name. So the patient name is in field 5. Now you can see in this example that the fields marry up with or they match up with the field names. That isn't always the case. You can't always assume that those fields are going to be they're going to be the same. Sometimes people use fields that have different names. For example, they might put the referring physician name in the scheduled performing physician's name or something like that. So it is good to double check those fields, but a lot of times they do line up. Now here's the problem. I just mapped the last name, but I also have to map the first name or the given name. But in DICOM, we want a caret in front of that. So I'm going to add a caret prefix to this mapping. And you can see up here in the preview, it shows me that it's going to add that caret between the last name and the first name. And in this case, I also want to add the middle initial or middle name. Now I'm going to scroll down, see if there's any other fields I need to map. So I know that I also have the patient's birth date, so I'm going to map the date of birth, and that is going to be in field 7. Now before I hit the Add button here, I have to make sure I get rid of that caret, otherwise it'll add the caret. I'm also going to add the patient's gender. And there we go. So I've added all the basic fields. Now let's say I messed up and I don't want to, say, have the middle name. Maybe I don't want to map the middle name. I could always double click on it, come over here, and I could remove that field if I wanted to. I'm not going to remove it because I do want the middle name, but you could remove those fields if you decide to change your mind or you don't want to use that field. So that's going to map the patient level. I'm going to change the action to check and insert if not found. This will take the patient ID, check to see if we have that patient ID, and if we already have the patient ID, it will update the patient's record. If we don't have the patient ID, then it will insert a new record. If you select insert, it will only insert. It will never update the record. So insert only inserts, and it does not do an update on the patient record. If you do update, it will only update but never insert a new record. The most common is check and insert if not found. That's the most common action. There are other actions in there, but again, check, insert if not found is the most common. All right, so we have the patient level. Let's go down to the visit. As I said before, the admission ID is not typically, by the way, first thing I always do is check and insert if not found so I don't forget. So the admission ID we know doesn't exist in this particular message. So in this case, I'm simply going to use the patient ID. I also saw in my message that I have a patient location. So I'm going to add the patient location since it's here. So that was in the patient visit segment, field number 3, point of care. And that'll add the location. I also see there's a referring physician name here, and my message does have that, so I'm going to add that field as well. I'm only going to add the last name, but you could build the full doctor name. All right, so that's the visit. Let's move down to requested procedure. We're going to check and insert if not found. So my requested procedure ID, I'm going to get from the ORC. The placer order number was where I've had the accession number, so that's where I'm going to map that. I'm going to add a code, which in this case I'm going to get my code from the OBR, field 4, the identifier, the coding schema, and of course the code meaning. Let's see, the study instance UID you do not have to map. We'll make one up automatically when we map the record. So we do automatically create one. If the HL7 message has a study UID, you could map it if you like, but you don't have to. Let's see, I'm going to add its procedure description, which is also in the Universal Service ID. Let's see if there's anything else in here that I can map. Here's the referring physician's name, so we can map that as well. That was in the PB1 segment. The accession number, which was in ORC field 2. You can see I'm reusing some of the fields. And that should do it for the requested procedure. And finally, let's do the scheduled procedure step. So the ID for the requested procedure, I'm going to get from OBR, field 2. The location, I'm going to get from PV1, field 3, point of care. Schedule procedure step start date. Let's see, I believe, and I don't recall, so let's see if we can find it here. I want to say that was field, oh, sorry, that's going to be in the OBR segment. Observation date time, that looks about right. So we'll do observation date time. There's also a start time, which is going to be the same field that's combined in this message. Let's see if there's anything else here. The procedure step description was in field 4. We also have a status, which was in the ORC field 5 that had the procedure status. The modality, this is a weird one, but the modality was in OBR 24. And I believe that's it. That's all we need for the schedule procedure step. So I've mapped patient, visit, request, and schedule procedure step. So now, if I come back, I'm going to click close, and I'm going to do a preview by going back to message. I'll show you how I got here. I went to message, process. I'm going to load that same message. This time, you'll notice that on the right-hand side, I got the database mapping. So now I can see that it's going to map all of the fields that I chose into the database. And I can go through here and make sure that the right fields are listed. So there's my visit. There's my requested procedure. Here's the scheduled procedure. So the 4 basic minimum fields are correctly populated. All right, so now that I've verified everything's populated, I'm going to go to dictionary, and I'm going to save that dictionary file. Now that that dictionary file is saved, I should be able to go back over here. So the product that processes HL7 messages is going to be the UltraBROKER. So I'm going to open up my UltraBROKER, which is already running. Now I'm going to create a listener. So I'm going to just remove all of these records so we can start from scratch. So I'm going to create a new HL7 listener. I'm going to call it training demo. I'm going to have it listen on port 9005. I'm going to set it to that dictionary file that I just saved, and then click OK. That's going to add my listener for HL7 on port 9005 using the dictionary that we just created. So now when I start my broker, you can see that HL7, the HL7 interface, is listening on port 9005 on that IP address. At this point, I should be able to send a message and see that order process into the broker, and I should see it process into the database, which could be used by any of our products like Ultra Prefetch or UltraBROKER, Ultra Gateway, Ultra Workflow, all of those products that we have that use the HL7 mapping. So let me go ahead and send one of those test messages. So the way that I typically send test messages, if you go into your UltraBROKER bin directory, there's an Ultra HL7 send utility. So I'm going to put in the IP address and the port number, in this case 9005. I'm going to go find that sample message that I had created. So there's sample message number 56. And there it is. And I'm going to hit send. And when I look over here, you can see it processed that message. Now, let's take a look in the database. So I processed the message. Let's see if we have a patient record. So it mapped the patient record. It also mapped the visit record. It did map the requested procedure record and the scheduled procedure step. They were all mapped into the database. And just to show you what most of our products would do, this selects from all of those fields, all of those tables at the same time with a join. This is how most of our products query for an order. It's going to look at all 4 of those tables together, and that would show it an order line item. So I'm going to click on execute, and you can see here I have all of the details about that order, and it looks like everything's populated. So I can see all of the major fields, all of the information I'd be interested in if I were going to use this for some kind of logic or workflow, such as prefetching or a modality work list feed, using it for the gateway for doing repair and things like that. So they're all populated. Now I want to show you 2 advanced techniques with mapping. The first one is what to do about extra fields. So if you recall, let me go ahead and minimize my broker and my test utility. So if you recall, in my test message, I also have a ZZZ segment. And let's say I wanted to map in the values from that segment. So to do that, back in my dictionary tool, I go to the segment modification. So I'm going to modify a segment. I'm going to go down here and click New Segment. The segment I'm adding is ZZZ. You can call it anything you like, special fields for training. In this case, I have 2 fields. And you can see up here I have 2 fields in my message. Field number 1, I'm just going to pick a random field type. And then for field number 2, I'll also pick just a regular text field type. Now the field types can also be customized. So if the thing that you're mapping doesn't already fit into one of the field types, you can make up your own field type and you can add an additional field type if you like. So, but like I said, I'm just using abnormal text because it contains the bare minimum that I need. So I'll be able to map up to 6 components within that field, which is fine. That'll work for the purposes of this mapping. So now that I have this all defined, I have my new ZZZ segment. I have my 2 fields within that segment. I click OK, and it's now added that new segment, which means if I go in here to customize, so I'm going to go into my ORM message, I should be able to add that additional segment. Now the problem is we don't see it here yet. If you recall, we don't have that segment added yet. So after the OBR, I want to add that new segment type. So I'm going to go in here. Oops, sorry, I'm on the wrong side. I'm going to go in here and find ZZZ. There it is, the one that I added. I'm going to add it as the last field. And now it's here. So now I have that segment in my basic message. I'm going to save it. I'm going to come back over here. Now I'm going to find a place to map it. So in this case, I'm going to go to my scheduled protocol code. I'm sorry, scheduled protocol or scheduled procedure step, the last table. And I'm going to add that. Oh, looks like I lost my previous mapping here. So I'll have to set that back up. My apologies, I didn't lose it. I forgot to select up here at the top. So you have to actually select that message type. So in my ORM, for scheduled procedure step, for the station AE title, maybe they're going to be sending that to me in ZZZ1. And maybe the station name is going to be in ZZZ2. So I've added those ZZZ segments. All right. Let's see. I also want to make sure I turn back on these actions, which get reset when we change a message type. All the fields are still here. I just have to make sure my actions are set to check and insert, which they are. So now that I've done that, I should be able to preview that same message. Now this time, you can see here that it's going to map test for the scheduled station AE and the scheduled station name. And if I look over here on the left-hand side, it does show me the values that are in that actual message. So now that I've made that change, I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to save my dictionary. In order for that dictionary to apply to my live feed, I have to open up the broker and I have to restart the service. By restarting the service, it's going to reinitialize that dictionary file. And now if I send a message, it should reprocess that message. Now I had the settings set to insert and update. And since I have it set to insert and update, if I go back to my database and look at the scheduled procedure step, you can see here it added test for the station AE title and the station name. So it did actually update the record, which is exactly what we wanted. Now I want to show you one other feature For enterprise facilities, in many cases, we have many more than just one patient ID. Let's say you've got a system of hospitals, and each hospital has a different identifier within its own hospital. There's still a master identifier, which is typically in PID 2, but they might have a PID list in PID 3, a list of different patient IDs. Let me go ahead and add that in here so you can see what that looks like. So take a look at what I did here in my PID.3, which is the patient identifier list. I added 3 different patient IDs. They're separated. Each patient ID section is separated by the tilde. So you can see a tilde right here. So that character, which by the way is this character right here, that's the component or the repeat separator. So there's my subcomponent separator and my repeat separator. So I have a repeat in here. So there's multiple patient IDs. So my 3 patient IDs are 633, 72, 5556. The first one is for Hospital A, the second one for Hospital B, and the third one for Hospital C. So the need might arise for us to keep all of the patient IDs for this single patient record. And then we may use them in different ways, in different products, in different workflows. But it's important for us to have awareness in the prefetch engine or in the gateway or in our broker product for us to have awareness of the various patient IDs. So in order to map those various patient IDs, first, I'm going to show you one additional table. So these are the initial tables. Off to the left over here, I'm going to add another table, and that is the patient identifier list. So patient identifier list is an optional table that you can add for orders. It doesn't have to be there, but you can add it so that we can use it. So I'm going to map into this table the patient ID and who owns that patient ID, or in this case, the assigning facility ID, which is Hospital A, B, or C. So let me go back to the dictionary tool. Let's take a look at the same message. Now that I've added these additional fields, you'll notice that PID 3, oops, let me upload it again. Looks like I forgot to save it. It's red up here, so let me hit the button to save that message. We'll load this again now that it's saved. All right, so in field 3, you can see I've got repeat 1, which is the ID number for Hospital A, repeat 2, which is the ID number for Hospital B, repeat 3, which is the ID number for Hospital C. So let's go ahead and map that. So I'm going to go back into my dictionary mapping, and we're going to add a record to the patient identifier list. This will be a check and insert if not found. The patient ID is going to be field 3, ID. And the assigning facility is going to come from field 5. Now, let's check and see if that works. So now, you can see that I have 3 records that are going to be mapped into the patient identification segment. So I have Hospital A's ID, then it's going to map Hospital B, and then finally Hospital C. So let me save that dictionary. I'm going to restart the broker. Coming back to my database. So right now, there is no patient identifier list because we didn't have it mapped before. But now, if I come back over here and send this message again, I'm going to check to make sure that it processed. I should see some records. And I do. I have each of those patient IDs now mapped, and there are the assigning facility IDs for each of those. So we can also take a look at these orders. So I made some minor changes to the query that includes all the tables. I added this additional table, which is the patient identifier. And now when I select with that additional table, Now I see that order 3 times. There's a version of that order for each of the patient identifiers. So I have the MPI, which is the master patient ID from field 2. I have each of their individual patient IDs for each of those hospitals. So I'd be able to look up the patient ID for that patient for any one of those hospitals for that order. And you can see the rest of the fields remain intact. In some cases, our messages may actually have several different OBRs. I'll show you an example. So in some cases, the message may look like this. Instead of just having one scheduled procedure sequence, instead we have 3. So this might be a chest of the, or a CT of the chest, abdomen, and pelvis. So here we have 3 different procedure codes. We can still handle this, and I'll show you how we do this. So in the database, or actually, I don't have to really change anything. When this message maps, it'll simply map 3 scheduled procedure steps for a single requested procedure, for a single visit, for a single patient. So when I reprocess this message, I'll now have, in total, I'll see 9 orders. I'll see 3 versions of each of these orders for the 3 different types. And I can mix and match those to see those if I need to from, say, a modality. But let me take a look. Let me show you how this is going to work. So coming back to our dictionary, I'm going to make a minor change. So we're going to add 1 additional table. So let me go back to the database just to show you what it looks like. So off to the other side over here, I have scheduled procedure step, but I can also add the protocol code sequence. And this additional table is for adding our additional steps to the procedure. And this would be fed out as a sequence in DICOM, but we could use it for things like prefetching or for the gateway and so forth, and also modality work list. So I have to add our additional fields here. So I'm going to go back into my dictionary. We're going to map in the scheduled protocol code. The code value is going to be from OBR4. The coding schema version, and of course the code meaning. I'm going to make sure I check and insert if not found. That should do it. I'll double check to make sure this is going to map. So now if I scroll down through here, you can see here it's going to map the additional scheduled protocol codes. So let's take a look and see if this works. So I'm going to save that dictionary file. And of course I have to restart the broker. So I'm going to stop it and start it. And I should be able to send this. Now before I send this, we've made a lot of changes here. So just to be on the safe side, so we don't confuse things, I'm going to delete everything from my patient table. And of course, since there's a cascading relationship here, it's going to delete all of the orders. So if I check this table, there's no orders. So if I come back over here and send this order, I'm going to verify that it was sent to the broker. I can come back over here, and now I have my orders. And if I wanted to, I'll show you up here. So my scheduled protocol code sequence, there's each of the steps for that procedure. And if you wanted to see them all together in one view, you could do that. So I've made a minor change to the view. I've added that additional protocol code sequence. So now when I select all the details for that order, now I've got a lot of different versions. I've got a version of this study. So for each patient ID at the local level, it shows me each of the steps for that procedure. This is just another way to look at this order. If I only wanted to look at the orders for one patient ID, I could add a where clause. So I could say where the assigning facility ID equals Hospital A, for example. And I only see Hospital A's patient IDs, and I just see the 3 steps for that particular procedure. So that's basically how you map these fields. And I only sent one message into my broker, but now that I've done that, if I have a bunch of messages that I could test with, so for example, in this case, I can send a whole folder of messages. And you can see back here in my broker, it's beginning to process all of those messages. And if I scroll back up, you can see it's starting to populate all of my patient information, all of my requested procedures, and so forth and so on. So that's how you map messages into the broker database.